Looking for the gift that keeps on giving? Therapy Notes, the highest rated EHR software, has everything you need to successfully run your practice. Whether you're a solo or group clinician, their comprehensive platform seamlessly combines scheduling, billing, documentation, assessment screening, telehealth, and more into one easy to use software. Try them for free for 2 months using promo code MODERN.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast for therapists about the things that go on in our field, the things that go on in our profession. And this is a follow-up to our follow-up episode on the 988 mental health crisis line. And we, several months ago, had done an episode following up on 988 a year in, what was publicly available as far as information. We had a call to action at the end that anybody who has some familiarity from the 988 systems to let us know what we're missing. And we had a couple of listeners respond back to us and say, what you're talking about is accurate, and it's not the complete picture. And we wanted to be able to share some of this information. The people who did reach out to us, because they like having jobs, they like having some anonymity, we're going to respect that, and we're going to relay some of the information that was given to us. So, Katie, I'm going to let you start on this, and we're going to start at the very beginning. People who apparently want to go and work the call centers for 988 seem like very good people with very good intentions. And one of the concerns that we've brought up is, how good is the actual training to be a call center person? So I'm going to kick it over to you and let you start with one of our listeners who emailed in.
So this person wrote, in 2023, I thought I'd volunteer for crisis text line. So somebody that was doing the texting that was going on. I'm a mod in an online support group. I thought I'd give a try at a suicide hotline, as I was actively supporting young troubled people via text in the support group anyway, on Reddit and Discord. Besides that, I'm an RN, so this is a pretty qualified person, and have many patients in crisis and wanted to learn more on how to speak to them. Plus, I've been somewhat suicidal myself throughout my life. Therapy helped a lot, but when it wasn't available, hotlines were my backup. I'd say I personally have made maybe 10 calls over 30 years. 3 were exceptionally helpful in the moment. 3 were just duds that were a waste of time. The rest were helpful to break my rumination. So we've also got lived experience here. So I wanted to do something to give back and to improve my communication skill. Googled volunteering, and crisis text line came up big. I assumed incorrectly that it was run by the national government, or that it and the 988 hotline were one and the same. Moreover, I didn't even realize then how fragmented 988 really is, learned after completing the training. So there's some screenshots here, and I'll just get some of that information here. Launch of 988, beginning July 16th, 2022. 988 will be the new 3-digit dialing code, blah, 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 for anyone experiencing mental health-related distress. What does this mean for us? Some of these chats and texts will be routed to crisis text line, making it so that more people are able to get support. This will not change the nature of the conversations on the platform, the skills of developing rapport with texters, blah, blah, blah. So it's basically, this is a backup to 988, this crisis text line. So our listener did the background check, began the training. No actual instructor involved in the training. It was an online module with simulations of what it's like to message someone on their platform, how to use the platform, and how to use their formula for helping. A clear progression from intro, information gathering, reflecting and supporting, summing up and closing. You're expected to use correct grammar and spelling, probably to help the AI interpret and learn. Preferred adjectives and descriptive and action words, and to adhere generally to patterns of interaction that get a texter calmer in about 20 minutes. And so there's some pictures of the training, and it does look very much modular, very much, it's a computer program is really what I'm seeing.
And for reference, we'll put these pictures in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com so you can see what we're referencing as well.
As a responder, you might have several texts ongoing with different texters at the same time, and you have a supervisor and a group chat in the window as well, along with a library of resource lists and AI prompts on where to take the conversation. It asks you to fill in blanks from the beginning, like asking for a name and location. Of course, the supervisor can monitor and enter the convo. The training has a modern, happy, positive, breezy kind of Amazon flavor to encourage the trainee. Like, don't stress. You'll have support the entire time. We're there for you. You're doing great and you've got this. Asking you to fill in the blank and pick the best worded response to a texter. At the end was one sample text convo graded by a real employee. And there's a picture of that there. You'll see that over in the show notes. Not going to lie, it reminded me a lot of when I did surveys at another place a few years back, in effect, teaching AI how to respond most naturally and helpfully. I didn't much care for asking texters their info and filling out those data points. That also reminded me of a job I had calling customers to sign them up for a rental service and putting their info to a database. But I trudged on through the training, ignoring my feelings until I came across the breezy claim that we're data nerds. We, meaning crisis text line and the whole body of people working there, I suppose. But what? Data nerds? It was presented as a good thing, but honestly, I couldn't figure out what made it a good thing in the context of an anonymous hotline. That one sentence kind of destroyed my trust all of a sudden. I started Googling the company then and found that there had been a whole for-profit data exchange with an AI company. Crisis Text Line insists that never ever will happen again. I'm like, okay, that's twisted, but makes more sense now. And I don't believe it can't happen again. My first shift taking real texters, I had a supervisor watching the interactions closely, and I had a question come up from the texter, are you a snitch? Before I could answer that, the supervisor gave me text to copy paste. I screenshotted that as I screenshotted a lot of training because I thought I might need to refer to that text again. So we have a screenshot there. And I think there's enough crossed out so we can put that in the show notes too. To this day, I can't decide if the text convos on that first day were real or more training. It felt like I was possibly speaking to an AI. I didn't sign back in after that first day. It was too uncomfortable to think that real people were coming there for help, and the only help I could give was by formula. And if their life were truly in danger, I was supposed to collect their name and location and turn them in. But I was also supposed to make up stuff like, we are a confidentiality hotline, but on the other hand, all the past conversations are not deleted and can be accessed by supervisors. It honestly gave me heebie-jeebies, not least because I myself have used suicide hotlines or similar. I thought hard and decided I couldn't participate. Just wanted you all to hear my story. Those are my concerns. Of course, if you use any of my statements on the show, I like to remain anonymous, so we can keep that there. And that's that person's experience. So talking about the training being pretty interesting, not very extensive, and concerns about AI and data. So that was part of our accurate but potentially incomplete.
In addition to scheduling, billing, and documentation, Therapy Notes also offers 24/7 live customer support, ensuring you get answers whenever you need them, no matter your schedule. And with new features and updates being released all the time, you'll always be up to date with the latest and greatest in practice management.
Try them free for 2 months using promo code MODERN.
I had the opportunity for an anonymous interview with one of our listeners who spent the better part of an hour talking with me about their experience in working in what I will call the greater Southeast United States as far as kind of a geographical region. And I know in some of our past episodes, more of our research had come to things that were based more locally for Katie and I in Los Angeles. So I had asked about the training as part of our interview, and this listener had responded that they had 9 40-hour weeks of supervised training in order to be able to start working the phones in response to people calling in. So this seems like
that's a lot of training.
That is a lot of training. And it's highly supervised, highly hands-on, which I think is quite different than the experience of the person that you read their email here. However, once the training is complete, the level of supervision and quality control is, quote, nil.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it goes from let's hold your hand for 9 weeks, and then you're on your own.
Speaking to the concerns around AI is that some of the training seems to be working to train AI, and secondhand report is that there's a particular AI program called Listen, Lyssn, that does seem to be working on measuring empathy within artificial intelligence, and we'll include a link to some stuff about Listen in our show notes as well. And Part of what workers are encouraged to do is to make sure that they are using certain keywords in protocols to ensure that AI is following along.
Okay. That seems pretty consistent with this other training from the other person, that they are trained to respond in potentially a clunky way in order to tag with keywords.
Yes. Now, when I picture 988, I picture a call center room, maybe some cubicles, some very wonderful people picking up ringing phones, people who are calling in the worst moments of their lives looking for help. And I was told that this is part of the job, but it's not entirely accurate. That part of the way that some 988 systems work is that 988 is contracted with various different funders, and we'll get back to the funding piece here in just a little bit. But some of these funding programs allow for people to put their information into the funding source, say, I need somebody to reach out to me. And the 988 centers have staff who call the individual members, or call the people who are in crisis. So it's not just pick up the phone, call 988. Sometimes it's the staffers who are calling and reaching out to people because they've put their information in.
Oh, that's interesting. So somebody can prepay for
Well,
their calls. They go to their funding stream, and I'm assuming that's like Medicaid or whatever their health insurance is, their mental health insurance is. They go to that site and put their information in, and 988 calls them back or
That's
calls them they initiate the call.
Yeah, that's my understanding, is that there's
Okay.
also an outbound call depending on who the funding source is. Now, I think it is important to talk about the funding source here, because this person that I spoke with talked about that a lot of the funding seems to be cobbled together. This is a system that, consistent with our emailer, is building the plane while it's flying. And the more that I talk with people and the more that I hear about 988, it's not just building the plane while it's flying, but it's like the plane has been slingshotted out into the air and everything needs to be built before it just comes crashing down,
Including the engine.
including the engine. But currently, the way that things stand is a lot of funding seems to be based in the CCBHC model for care. That stands for the Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinic model, or public health funding model. And this is where there has been pockets of federal funding for pilots in various ways, with the expectation for states to pick up the funding along the way. And consistently across both of our episodes, and the people who helped us contribute to this episode are saying it leads to this very fragmented system where things are going to be wildly different from one jurisdiction to another. And on the worker side of things, it is very clear not to have steady funding. Now, last week in our episode, we were talking about the way that money works and the way that grants can kind of make it to where certain protocols have to be met in different ways. And that means that different protocols end up having to happen based on who the funding source is. And the way that this looks in where this listener works is based on the type of contract that is funding which callers are calling in crisis. It entirely changes the protocol in how the caller has to respond to who's calling in crisis.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm understanding. So we've got someone puts their information into their funding source. So an insurance plan, a federal plan like Medicaid or those types of things, or a state plan like Medicaid. And when they get the call back, where their funding comes from determines how they are treated on their call.
Exactly.
Okay, that seems a little bit weird and maybe not equitable.
And that was one of the things that stood out to me, is based on how wealthy or how good somebody's insurance is changes how well they may be treated. Some of the various funding, as you pointed out, is from Medicaid. There's also a USDA contract program called AgriStress for farmers and ranchers to deal with their mental health, which was news to me, and at face value sounds really good and
Sure.
positive for a very targeted market. But the point is that as a worker, the protocol can be entirely different from one person to the next. Now, the goals are that for people who are calling in, calls have to be answered by the second ring.
Okay.
Now, and this is fingers crossed, hoping that call centers are staffed well enough that it's not ring, ring, hello, can you hold on while I am finishing up another call? It doesn't seem like that, but the documentation is also very different depending on which contract is funding the calls.
So there's the equity piece, which is depending on how good your insurance is or how good the facilitator of your plan is in making sure that you have targeted, kind of response to these calls. It's also, I'm just thinking from a clinician side or from a worker side, I have to know the protocol. Or, I mean, I guess a good manager could just say, you respond to the Medicaid calls, you respond to the other call, this funding sources calls. But it seems like that would get even clunkier too. It just seems like a hard thing to manage from the worker side, that I have to follow through on a different protocol depending on which insurance this client has.
Now, for people who call in and a call center worker ends up picking up the phone, I've been reading a lot of online responses. I've been reading a lot of online reviews. People might be concerned that merely calling in with suicidal thoughts will lead them to have law enforcement interactions or having safety protocols put in place that might be above the level that is actually needed, especially the way that 988 is being advertised as kind of a crisis line rather than a, hey, the cops are going to show up at your door kind of line.
Yeah.
And in my interview, we talked about that there are several different decision trees that end up being presented to the callers that help to determine the level of imminent risk. And so I'm actually a fan of this in crisis type situations. And there's
Sure.
lots of research in various fields that show that the less we're relying on in the moment decision making, the better off that we tend to be. The interviewee that I talked with had spoken about that, at least at their call center, all of the staff has a very good idea of the risks involved in calling law enforcement. So that seemed to be a really big point of emphasis in their training, and that there is a lot of follow-up questions. For example, if somebody says, hey, I'm really stressed out, I banged my head against the wall, that's not immediately assigned as this is self-injury leading towards imminent death, that there's follow-up questions that need to be asked about levels of severity.
It seems to me, based on what we had researched, read, reviewed prior to the previous episode, that this is part of the disjointed nature of 988 as well. Because I think I could see different philosophies or other decision trees that are at different centers that would lead to more immediate hospitalization and or police involvement versus ones where there's deeper training, like 9 40-hour weeks, where there's a little bit more nuance in that assessment and it's not something that's gone too quickly. Because some of the stories that we saw in those articles were, it felt at least that those callers had been kind of referred to law enforcement pretty early.
Right.
And, it's always perception of the person and how they're talking and those kinds of things. Some people have a different dramatic flair in how they talk about things versus don't. And I'm hoping that the training is sufficient to help parse through that and sort through it and help callers understand the consequences of how they're speaking to whether or not the law enforcement is called. But to me, it sounds like this, at least this center where this listener works, has sufficient training to actually to protect callers, which is nice. It's good to hear that.
And I think that there's also some really, I will call it not necessarily completely trauma informed, but based on some of the bigger fears as far as actually working at some of these places. This caller said that in a typical 8-hour shift, There's no expectation that calls have to have a certain time limit, that if it goes well beyond an hour, that is okay.
Oh, okay.
And in a typical 8-hour shift, you might expect to end up working 10 to 20 calls, and no worker is expected to immediately take back-to-back calls. That there is a time off in between each calls. I didn't ask a follow-up question as far as how long, but it seemed to be at least 10 minutes
Okay.
to be able to gather, and that there is ongoing trainings as part of new grants that end up coming in as far as funding. So it does seem to be kind of responsive to the workers' needs. Although I will point out that the pay at this particular call center is $18 an hour, which was described as you get what you pay for.
Oh,
And so it's not necessarily a long-term idea around this is something that is realistically going to be something where you expect to have a long career.
sure. And I think that's a general understanding about crisis hotlines, right? I don't see that as a long-standing job. I feel like it would be irresponsible to stay on it too long, as people probably get pretty burned out, I would imagine, just from the compassion fatigue.
Additionally, for every 988 call, the call centers offer follow-up calls. And this is
Hmm.
part of not just responding to people as they're calling in, and they can offer a follow-up call. They get consent. They get consent to leave a message if somebody else is picking up a phone. It can be a follow-up call in an hour. It can be a couple of hours, and it could be potentially even the following day. So follow-up calls are something that is offered.
That's cool. It provides a little bit of additional support, which I think can be really critical for folks who are at the stage that they're considering suicide.
So a mixed bag so far, but a lot of our discussion ended up coming around some of this disjointed aspects and really around making 988 a regularly funded and working and not such a patchwork program. And
Yeah.
I asked what would be the best answer to this, and the listener had responded that in some areas that have a large population, you're going to have potentially better supported call centers. So you're going to have funding that looks at, okay, there are several million people in the Los Angeles area, for
For
example.
sure.
Whereas in more rural states, some of these call centers are covering multiple states.
Oh,
And
wow.
that's going
Okay.
to lead to some potential funding problems. And so what it's going to take is dedicated funding at the federal level. I'm imagining, all right, state A says, yes, we're going to contribute. State B says, well, if state A is paying for it, we don't have to. And that could be somewhat problematic. But the suggestion was that since federal funding is probably something that's never going to happen on just a consistent level, that there should be maybe some calls to action towards creating some matching funding from the federal government that matches whatever states contribute to it in order to make this a longer and more robust system.
I like that idea. I actually like both ideas, but I think you're right. I don't believe that just blanket federal funding is likely. One of the things that can happen when there is consistent funding sources is that there's also dedicated procedures, protocols that are consistent across a lot of different places. So the funding guides the I don't know what's the opposite of truncated and divided. A unified. There we go. A unified process. And so, for example, someone who's trained in California could also cover for a crisis hotline in North Carolina, right? So it could be something where there's such consistency across all of the 988 hotlines that there's quality control, there's consistency, there's a lot of, I don't know, just a better process. The piece that I think is interesting that both of our listeners put forward, and I think was part of the conversations that we had previously on this topic, is the presence of AI. And whether they're doing the crisis text line, whether there's some AI process in sorting through, getting information up front, and all of that, there's some fear about that because AI is still fairly new, and we're concerned about, what the robot revolution and they're taking over. And I could see it as a big cost saving mechanism that would allow for potentially, when you need a person on this crisis hotline, that person could be better trained, better compensated. And so I think that with caution, I think allowing for some of these AI processes might help with the funding mechanism, because it would be theoretically, once the development costs are covered, much cheaper. As we've talked about in our AI episodes, I think there's potential for bias and also less bias and all of those things that might be very helpful.
One of the things that I could see happening with AI, if there is more of a national unity, is the ability to, based on where callers are calling in, is the AI can help assist whoever is working in the staffing center to be able to have a more dynamic approach and not just be, well, here's the protocol based on where my jurisdiction is. And so I can see that as a useful tool there.
Well, could even, have a sort through resources, be able to provide a lot of information in addition to helping with improving the call quality.
But that would have to go into some of the geolocation stuff that we had spoken as being part of it. The person that I interviewed said that most of their programs don't have geolocation capabilities. We had talked about Vibrant as one of the companies behind some of the 988 centers. Their programs potentially do. I imagine that this is going to continue to end up being kind of a larger piece of things as we see 988 continuing to be built out.
Sure.
Some of the funding stuff, and this kind of was part of the conversation around the support for the people taking the calls. And I had asked, what are some of the ways that things could be improved? And our listener had said that despite some of the structural things that we had pointed out to, as far as some of the positives, going all the way back to the beginning of the episode around the no support really beyond the training, is having more communication and support from management to the people who are taking the calls. And it's not for a lack of want, but it's for a lack of funding to have enough management support to be able to have the check-in on people. And for anybody who's ever worked in community mental health, this is probably very, very consistent to what you've experienced in those environments.
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is when you're working leanly because you're very poorly funded, a lot of those trauma-informed practices seem like niceties, seem like extravagances that you don't have time for. And folks are already probably putting in more hours than they're paid for in the management levels, because, a lot of these folks, because they're not paid well, are, working out of the goodness of their heart. And so, as we've talked about a bazillion times, it leads to burnout, it leads to compassion fatigue, it leads to bad management, because they're so bitter and burned out that they don't think about how their behavior is starting to impact the folks they're overseeing.
And some of the benefits for more advanced funding on this, the state where this listener is based says that it's not just for funding the 988 system itself, but it's also funding the continuum of mental health care. And some of this is looking at being able to better fund the infrastructure in the communities for the handoffs for people that do need that higher level of intervention. And in this particular state, Medicaid accounts for over half of all mental health funding.
Oh,
So
wow.
if you are one of those data nerds, you can probably narrow that down pretty quickly. You got a 1 in 50 chance. Uh,
Sure.
this would increase things like mobile crisis responses that may or may not lead to a higher level of care. It might lead to having more beds available for people who do need that funding, and would also, as it looks more at the actual 988 system, being able to pay staffers more in order to prevent things like burnout, and being able to have more consistent, more qualified, more experienced people who are responding. So that way, less has to be spent in investing for people to get trained in this entire system.
Yeah. There is kind of this idyllic system, and we talked about it in the Fixing Mental Health Care in America episodes that we started long ago, and there's a few that we're still working on and we haven't put out to the audience. So maybe we'll revisit some of that because it seems super relevant at this point. But this idyllic sense of you start with a dedicated hotline that is for mental health. You have an infrastructure put in place where it's an array of services. It's a spectrum of services from the most gentle to the most intense. And I think that there's really good thought around what this could look like. I think as a society, we so downplay the importance of mental health and the need for mental health services that trying to get funding streams for all of these different levels of care, including the 988 hotline and the adjunctive services that they could provide or that they could lead to or connect to, it just feels like this hopelessness around we've got this great idea and we can't get it funded because people don't care about mental health, or they don't think that we should pay this much for mental health. And so I'm sure there's advocacy there, and I've been waxing poetic, so I'll turn it back over to you. But I do think that there's a pretty solid plan here. Could it be funded and well trained?
And I think it's going to come largely at this point down to the state jurisdictions that come on this. And while the Biden administration has invested a lot of money in 988 over the years that this has been in place, it's still incredibly fragmented. It's like many government programs is not something that's a perpetual funding. And so it's going to rely on who's in Congress. It's going to rely on who's in some of the state legislatures. And historically, things like this become, all right, here's going to be the potential sunset of this program. Now, I do think that something like this is probably not going away anytime soon, but the investments in this kind of stuff really come down to the human power of being able to respond to people in times of needs.
Yeah.
The funding does seem to largely rely on the company Vibrant that we had talked about in our previous episode. And while there are concerns around the AI that they may be developing or using, that's where the funding seems to be going, and seems to be one of the places that I'll reluctantly say, if it's gonna go somewhere and it's a place that's at least putting some things in place in order to help people in crisis, it's better than nothing.
Yeah. I think it is.
The last quote that I will cite from our listener is, if people are going to call in, the system needs to work.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
The statistics that we had cited in our last episode are that most people who call in and utilize the system do get help. The percentage of people that are receiving problematic calls does seem to be very much in the minority of people who are having interactions with the 988 system. The overall concerns are, can we do better? And usually when it comes to systems like this, the answer is yes, and it comes down to money.
Exactly.
We will put a lot of things in our show notes. You can find those over at mtsgpodcast.com. As always, we love listener feedback. It helps us to not just wax poetic about whatever Katie and my ideas are. Please let us know what your experiences are with things, what you would like us to cover in our episodes. You can do that through any of our social media. And by any, we most often check Instagram and Facebook. And email us, join our Facebook group, the Modern Therapist Group. And until next time, I'm Curt Widhelm with Katie Vernoy.
Thanks again to our partner, Therapy Notes. Don't forget to use promo code MODERN for 2 free months today and see why they're the #1 trusted EHR among behavioral healthcare professionals.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.